how do you see growth as attached to reduction of violence?
It's very hard to see how anything like the kinds of societies we have in Western Europe, the United States, could function without growth. I think the way sort of a parliamentary Republican democracy works is you have a group of people sitting around the table, they craft complicated legislation, and there's a lot of horse trading. And as long as the pie is growing, you can give something to everybody. When the pie stops growing, it becomes a zero-sum dynamic, and the legislative process does not work. And so the sort of democratic types of parliamentary systems we've had for the last 250 years have mapped onto this period of rapid growth. I think people generally don't think of the problem of violence as quite as central as I think it is. I think it's a very deep problem, on a human level. If you think of sort of this mimetic element to human nature, where we copy one another, we want the things other people want, and there's sort of there's a lot of room for conflict, and that if it's not channeled very carefully, a violent conflict in human relationships and in human societies, between human societies, and this is sort of I think a very, very deep problem. Human beings are, if not evil, they're at least dangerous, and I think the sort of softer anthropological biases that a lot of people have in sort of late modernity or in the Enlightenment world are that humans are by nature good, they're by nature peaceful, and that's not the norm.
One thing that I sense that both of us get frustrated with is that if you think about growth as necessary to contain certain violence, and you think about growth as largely also being how much fossil fuels you're able to burn, climate is not paired with kind of a reduction in opulence. It's paired on the other side with war. And if you over-focus on climate and you result in a situation in which growth is slowed to a halt. Now, growth doesn't need to be the amount of fossil fuel you burn, but it has largely been that up until the present. You actually see that the trade-off that you're facing is very different than the one that's usually portrayed by either side. And somehow we never get around to that conversation, which would be, if we were very serious about climate, would we be plunged into war?
Yeah, obviously you can't have an economy without an environment, but it may also be the case that you can't have an environment without an economy.
Right.
And then if both of those statements are true, maybe the set of solutions, the set of best solutions looks really different than if you just focus on one and not the other.
You invited me to a conference that you were keeping quiet, and I was in the news, and there was quite a lot of anger and furor that I had done something wrong. And you waited a few days to give a talk, and you talked about scapegoating and the mechanism by which violence that might be visited upon the many is visited upon the one. And then you also started talking about the king as if he is sort of scapegoat in waiting, so that the king is not necessarily something that one would want to be. And I found it absolutely fascinating because it turned so many ideas on their heads.
You could say there's an arbitrariness about scapegoating because the scapegoat is supposed to represent, to stand in for everybody. And so the scapegoat has to be perceived as someone who's radically other, but then also has to somehow emerge from within the group. And so there are times when the scapegoat is the sort of outlier, extreme insider, extreme outsider, king/criminal, or whatever personality, and that's probably a dangerous sort of thing. It's like Abraham Lincoln, the incredible orator who's also grows up in a log cabin. So these sort of extreme contrasts are often people who are at risk of this maybe more than others.
But then the other part of it that I find terrifying, but also interesting, is that implicit in this framework is that there is a minimal level of violence needed to accomplish an end. And that the scapegoating mechanism, while entirely unjust, has the virtue of being minimal in that the horror is visited upon the individual.
Yes. Or the theological terminology Girard would use would be that scapegoating is satanic, and that archaic cultures were a little bit satanic, but not very. And they were sort of satanic in an innocent way, because the violence was actually, a way to limit violence. Violence is both, it's both a disease and a cure for the disease. A nation state contains violence in both senses of the word contain, because
that's good.
It contains it as it limits it, it channels it in certain ways, but then it's also part of its very being.